Let's go to Jay Carney. I want to bring Jay Carney in as a CNN political commentator, the former White House press secretary. Take us a little bit behind the scenes. He sent a letter to Congress saying he's doing this. He submitted some specific language for legislation. What about an address like this, the statement he's about to make? Take us a little bit behind the scenes, Jay, and tell us what goes into this kind of televised statement.
Well, has prepared remarks. He's reviewing them. He'll be coming out shortly. I think to the earlier point about why in the middle of the day from the Roosevelt Room, not a national address, I think that has to do with the fact that this operation has already been underway for 6 months. It's basically a request for authorization for something that's already happening and for something he doesn't believe he needs legally to receive authorization. But he does want Congress's buy-in on this. He did from the beginning and said so. It was very clear in the fall that Congress wasn't prepared to deal with this issue in the run-up to a midterm election. Now we have a new Congress here. It's the beginning of 2015, and he wants to see if he can get this done. I think, to Danielle's point, I think it's a pretty profound statement to say this is not like Afghanistan and not like Iraq. Those were pretty major wars, the longest in our history, and very consequential in terms of our presence in the Middle East and our strategy going forward. There's no question that given where this president's been, that he believes open-ended, blank check authorizations are not the right way to go. You know, he very famously, and probably did himself some harm in doing so, said he didn't want to strike Syria without Congress's vote, and Congress wasn't going to pass that vote, and he got criticized for it. So I think he wants this. He'll move forward with the operation if he doesn't get it, but it is important to restrict it so the American people don't think we're going into another open-ended war in the Middle East.
All right, hold on for a moment. Everybody hold on. We're just Jake Tapper, we're just a few seconds away from the President of the United States. He's going to be walking into the Roosevelt Room here at the White House to make this statement. He knows he's addressing not only members of Congress, he's addressing the American public, but he's also, in effect, addressing the world right now, including in Iraq and Syria and ISIS, for that matter.
That's right, and the message is very important, exactly, and you're going to probably hear messages that are a little bit conflicting in terms of the need to defeat this group. Actually, in the preamble to the resolution, the White House has written the names of the American hostages, the 4 American hostages who have been killed by ISIS, including most recently Kayla Mueller, whose death was confirmed yesterday. But at the same time, he's also going to be trying to reassure the American people, at the same time he's trying to scare ISIS, that this is not going to be an open-ended conflict like the ones that they have grown so weary of, and like the one that helped elect him, his opposition to the Iraq War, that helped elect him and get him into the position he is right now, Wolf.
And so the president is going to be making this statement. I suspect there won't be an opportunity for reporters who may be in the Roosevelt Room at the White House to ask the president any questions, but he'll go on. He's got a very carefully drafted statement right now, which will reinforce the letter he sent to Congress and at the same time the specific authorizing legislation for the United States to use military force and go after ISIS in Iraq and Syria. This is an important statement that the president is making. His supporters on Capitol Hill say if he wants to get this legislation passed, he's going to have to work it. He's going to have to work it hard. He's going to have to convince members of his own party as well as conservative critics that this is the right thing for the United States to do right now. And one of the loopholes in this proposed language that the president wrote in his letter to Congress is it would allow U.S. combat forces, the U.S. to use combat force, here comes the president, if there were special operations.
Come on, John. Good afternoon. Today, as part of an international coalition of some 60 nations, including Arab countries, our men and women in uniform continue to fight against ISIL in Iraq and in Syria. More than 2,000 coalition airstrikes have pounded these terrorists. We're disrupting their command and control and supply lines, making it harder for them to move. We're destroying their fighting positions, their tanks, their vehicles, their barracks, their training camps, and the oil and gas facilities and infrastructure that fund their operations. We're taking out their commanders, their fighters, and their leaders. In Iraq, local forces have largely held the line and in some places have pushed ISIL back. In Syria, ISIL failed in its major push to take the town of Kobani, losing countless fighters in the process, fighters who will never again threaten innocent civilians. And we've seen reports of sinking morale among ISIL fighters as they realize the futility of their cause. Now, make no mistake, this is a difficult mission, and it will remain difficult for some time. It's going to take time to dislodge these terrorists, especially from urban areas. But our coalition is on the offensive. ISIL is on the defensive, and ISIL is going to lose. Its barbaric murders of so many people, including American hostages, are a desperate and revolting attempt to strike fear in the hearts of people it can never possibly win over by its ideas or its ideology, because it offers nothing but misery and death and destruction. And with vile groups like this, there is only one option. With our allies and partners, we are going to degrade and ultimately destroy this terrorist group. And when I announced our strategy against ISIL in September, I said that we are strongest as a nation when the President and Congress work together. Today, my administration submitted a draft resolution to Congress to authorize the use of force against ISIL. I want to be very clear about what it does and what it does not do. This resolution reflects our core objective to destroy ISIL. It supports the comprehensive strategy that we've been pursuing with our allies and our partners. A systemic and sustained campaign of airstrikes against ISIL in Iraq and Syria, support and training for local forces on the ground, including the moderate Syrian opposition, preventing ISIL attacks in the region and beyond, including by foreign terrorist fighters who try to threaten our countries, regional and international support for an inclusive Iraqi government that unites the Iraqi people and strengthens Iraqi forces against ISIL, humanitarian assistance for the innocent civilians of Iraq and Syria who are suffering so terribly under ISIL's reign of horror. I want to thank Vice President Biden, Secretaries Kerry and Hagel, and General Marty Dempsey for their leadership in advancing our strategy. Even as we meet this challenge in Iraq and Syria, we all agree that one of our weapons against terrorists like ISIL, a critical part of our strategy, is the values we live here at home. One of the best antidotes to the hateful ideologies that try to recruit and radicalize people to violent extremism is our own example as diverse and tolerant societies that welcome the contributions of all people, including people of all faiths. The resolution we've submitted today does not call for the deployment of U.S. ground combat forces to Iraq or Syria. It is not the authorization of another ground war, like Afghanistan or Iraq. The 2,600 American troops in Iraq today largely serve on bases. And yes, they face the risks that come with service in any dangerous environment, but they do not have a combat mission. They are focused on training Iraqi forces, including Kurdish forces. As I've said before, I'm convinced that the United States should not get dragged back into another prolonged ground war in the Middle East. That's not in our national security interest, and it's not necessary for us to defeat ISIL. Local forces on the ground who know their countries best are best positioned to take the ground fight to ISIL, and that's what they're doing. At the same time, this resolution strikes the necessary balance by giving us the flexibility we need for unforeseen circumstances. For example, if we had actionable intelligence about a gathering of ISIL leaders, and our partners didn't have the capacity to get them, I would be prepared to order our special forces to take action, because I will not allow these terrorists to have a safe haven. So we need flexibility, but we also have to be careful and deliberate. And there's no heavier decision than asking our men and women in uniform to risk their lives on our behalf. As Commander-in-Chief, I will only send our troops into harm's way when it is absolutely necessary for our national security. Finally, this resolution repeals the 2002 authorization of force for the invasion of Iraq and limits this new authorization to 3 years. I do not believe America's interests are served by endless war or by remaining on a perpetual war footing. As a nation, we need to ask the difficult and necessary questions about when, why, and how we use military force. After all, it is our troops who bear the costs of our decisions, and we owe them a clear strategy and the support they need to get the job done. So this resolution will give our armed forces and our coalition the continuity we need for the next 3 years, It is not a timetable. It is not announcing that the mission is completed at any given period. What it is saying is that Congress should revisit the issue at the beginning of the next president's term. It's conceivable that the mission is completed earlier. It's conceivable that after deliberation, debate, and evaluation, that there are additional tasks to be carried out in this area. And the people's representatives, with a new president, should be able to have that discussion. In closing, I want to say that in crafting this resolution, we have consulted with and listened to both Republicans and Democrats in Congress. We've made a sincere effort to address difficult issues that we've discussed together. In the days and weeks ahead, we'll continue to work closely with leaders and members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. I believe this resolution can grow even stronger with the thoughtful and dignified debate that this moment demands. I'm optimistic that it can win strong bipartisan support and that we can show our troops and the world that Americans are united in this mission. Today, our men and women in uniform continue the fight against ISIL, and we salute them for their courageous service. We pray for their safety. We stand with their families who miss them and who are sacrificing here at home. But know this, our coalition is strong, our cause is just, and our mission will succeed. And long after the terrorists we face today are destroyed and forgotten, America will continue to stand free and tall and strong. May God bless our troops, and may God bless the United States of America. Thank you very much, everybody.
The president, flanked by his national security team, including the vice president, the secretary of state, the outgoing secretary of defense in the Roosevelt Room, speaking relatively briefly, 7 or 8 minutes, about justifying his decision to go ahead and seek congressional authorization for the use of military force against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Jake, the president was very, very precise, saying he's not seeking what President Bush sought, a full-scale war in Iraq or Afghanistan, for that matter. He wants a very limited operation.
That's right, and yet he also did say, as I suppose a way of trying to reassure those who are concerned about this 3-year end date for this authorization, that doesn't necessarily mean the authorization will end there. He said very clearly that this is not a timetable. They're not ending things in 3 years. It's just a recognition that Congress should revisit this issue at the beginning of the next president's term. It's conceivable the task will have been accomplished. It's conceivable there will be more to be done. So it is attempting to take off the table this debate over whether this 3-year period is a liability. He's saying it's not a liability. The next president should debate it and in the next administration.
I want to go to northern Iraq right now. Phil Black is on the scene for us, right in the middle of a lot of that fighting in Dohuk in northern Iraq. So how's this likely to play over there where you are, Phil, the statement by the president that we all just heard?
Well, Wolf, you heard the president there talking about local forces being best placed to take the fight to ISIS. Up until now, that has meant only one local force, that is the Peshmerga, the military force of semi-autonomous Iraqi Kurdistan. This has been the fighting force that has been on the ground, stopping the ISIS advance in this region of northern Iraq, steadily rolling back their gains, and it is the same fighting force that has now contained them, limited the area of operation for ISIS within this region. Now, the leadership of that fighting force does not expect greater US involvement on the ground here. That's what they tell us, but that is a source of some disappointment to them. They would gladly see what they describe as greater commitment. They say that could include potentially ground forces, but if not ground forces, then some other form of greater practical support to help them out in their fight against ISIS here on the ground, because their view is that while they are grateful for the airstrikes that have no doubt played a huge part in the military successes in this part of the world over the last 6 months or so, they need greater support because they say they are unarmed, they are not unarmed, but outgunned certainly. They do not have the armor, the heavy weapons necessary to go up against ISIS. So from the Iraqi Kurds, disappointment that this policy is not going to change in the near term, certainly. From the central government in Baghdad, That would be a much harder sell when it comes to the idea of getting ground forces back into Iraq again. American ground forces in Iraq once more would be a much harder sell to the broader Iraqi Arab public, and the central government in Baghdad certainly will.
I want you to stand by. Be careful over there. Phil Black is in northern Iraq in Dohuk. I want to go back to the White House. Our senior White House correspondent, Jim Acosta, was listening very carefully to what the president said. We had a statement that he submitted to Congress earlier, proposed legislation, and now these televised remarks, if you will. Give us your analysis, Jim, on what we just heard.